From the WNIN Tri-State Public Media Center in downtown Evansville, I'm David James, and this is 2 Main Street. So imagine being 5 years old, your family forced from their comfortable home into a crowded ghetto with little food and under constant fear of being killed. That's how Irene Rechnick remembered her childhood in Poland. Let's go back to 1939. The Nazis invaded her homeland, and the nightmare began. To save her life, Irene's Jewish parents paid a Catholic family to take their child and raise her as their own. Of course, that had to be a heartbreaking decision. Irene became one of the so-called hidden children of World War II. In 1945, the nightmare finally ended, and in what can be only described as a miracle, Irene and her parents all survived the Holocaust, eventually came to the U.S., and settled in Evansville. It's a remarkable story worth retelling. Irene died in July of 2022, and she wanted all of us to remember what happened to her and the millions of innocent victims of the Holocaust. Before her death, she established the Edward D. and Regina Rechnick Holocaust series at the University of Southern Indiana. The series, named in honor of her parents, will feature speakers to keep the history of the Holocaust alive and, most importantly, to make us sure it never happens again. My guest is the inaugural speaker of the Rechnick Holocaust series, Evansville attorney Charlie Berger. So, Charlie, Irene, of course, was passionate that the Holocaust not be just a footnote in history.
She was very much, and she spent a great deal of time creating the trust out at USI, and unfortunately, because of COVID, it was delayed 2 years, this inaugural presentation, and she died shortly before it actually was delivered. That was the sad part of it.
Yeah, but she knew it was going to happen.
She did know it was going to happen. She talked to me. She sent me notes. I'd known her a long time. But so we had the initial presentation, and now it will be there to be presented, hopefully into perpetuity, that people will come so people never forget about the Holocaust, which was her principal goal about what went on. She was never in a concentration camp, but her parents were. And it is a remarkable story that the family that her parents left her with were willing to return her to them when they showed up back after they had recovered and been basically liberated by Allied troops.
And you told me that there was no paperwork involved in these hidden children transfers, so the families that took in these children really didn't have to give them up.
No, and some didn't. Mm-hmm. And that was what was remarkable in the situation for Irene, was that they did return her. But one of the things that she talked about that was, I can't imagine being a child and hearing this, but even the family that liked her father was somebody that had worked with for him in the coal mines that they operated, said that he didn't really disagree with the Nazis, but he was doing it because he really liked her father, and they kept her and hid her and at their own risk of harm, because families that were discovered to be hiding Jews, they were exterminated just like the Jews.
So they were taking a risk.
Oh, they were very.
Of course, they're being paid to take a risk too.
They were being paid, but once they were gone, nobody there to enforce the agreement.
Sure. Now, what happened to the Rechnick family reads like a script from a Hollywood movie, as we talked about a well-to-do family in Poland, forced to move into a ghetto, and the family was very successful in Poland managing coal mines, you said in your series.
Right. They were a successful family, and they were industrious and had worked hard throughout. And Eddie, her father, Edward David, knew how to work with folks that were working for him, so that it wasn't like they felt like they were being oppressed. Mm-hmm. one of the things that I learned in preparing for this lecture was how Edward would bring some of the workers home, and Regina would feed them, and or he would go drinking with them and have a beer or two after work from the mines to basically communicate to the people that were doing the hard work that he wasn't any better than them. And I think that was probably somewhat critical in Irene surviving, just that kind of atmosphere that he was not any different than anybody else.
Now, Irene did spend several years of her young life in the ghetto, Dubrovia Gornicha.
Very good.
And that's near the border with Germany and Poland.
Correct.
And does she remember anything about those years in the ghetto?
She remembered some, just that it was, they had to wear, eventually they had to wear Star of David. They had different garb that they had to wear, and eventually that particular ghetto was not closed off in the beginning, but eventually it was, and she did remember that occurring. And then before they were going to be shipped out of there is when their parents were able to make the move to this family that took care of her.
So they must have known that it was time. Their time was up there, and they were going to be shipped out to this other camp. And I think the children who arrived at Auschwitz under the age of 12, I think, were sent to the gas chamber.
Yeah, they were killed.
Yeah.
So Eddie was a smart guy, and had to be as successful as he was there, and even to come to the United States and develop his own business here was kind of a remarkable story.
So now Edward and Regina, Irene's parents, were put on a train with others from the ghetto and taken to Auschwitz, which was, I think, about 30 miles away, or it was not too far away.
Right.
And then there was a labor camp there.
They were in the labor camp for about a year, and then at the end of that, they were then put into Auschwitz. And then once the Germans feared that the Russians were about to take over the area, they put them on a death march to head out to Germany.
Mm-hmm. And you said on that death march, Regina's sister didn't
She didn't make it. Regina's sister, Irene, recalled her mother telling the story of
Irene's
mother.
Yeah.
Irene recalled her mother, Regina, telling the story of her sister being much weaker than Regina, and it was a snowy day, and she fell out of the line to get some water because they didn't have any food or water, and she tried to get back in line and into the march, and the German soldier just shooting her in the snow next to her, right there in front of her mom, obviously killing her. And those were stories that were not isolated.
Sure. So anyway, then the survivors of this death march they go into Germany, is that correct?
Right. And they went to
a couple of camps in Germany.
They were in a couple of camps in Germany that were then eventually freed.
And liberated, weren't they?
Yes, by the Allied troops. One of the camps they went to was Mauthausen, and that was near Auschwitz, but that was this labor camp that they were at. And
we've all seen
and it was actually Buchenwald was where was the concentration camp they ended up at.
Now we've all seen probably the video of the liberation of these camps and the condition of the prisoners in these camps. And now you said Eddie was in pretty bad shape?
Yes, he only weighed 80 pounds when they were liberated. And so then they went to another location to be kind of
rehabilitated.
Rehabilitated. And was only after that rehabilitation and somehow connecting again with his wife, Regina, that they were able to go and locate their daughter and eventually get to, they were in France, but they eventually ended up in Belgium, and they spent some time in Belgium before they came to the United States.
Now, all of their possessions in Poland were just looted?
Yeah, they were gone. They didn't have anything. Except
There was no reason to go back there.
The only reason they went back there was to get their daughter.
Right. And of course, so many Jews were killed that they knew there in that community. Wow. Now, did Irene recall that reunion with her parents? Was that an awkward or joyous, or did she remember them?
She remembered them. I just didn't get into that conversation with her. So unfortunately, that's lost through her death, and that's something that.
Well, obviously, her parents would look a lot different to her.
Oh yeah, they did, and she was older. By when they got back, I think she was 11 then. I think she was around 5 or that when they left her off. But, I found that I also knew her aunt and uncle, Nathan and Alina Recknick, and they didn't talk a great deal about it. It wasn't something they talked about. Alina did a video once for a student at Central High School, and somehow I don't know where that video is, but it wasn't a lot done to preserve what went on with them that way.
Well, that seems to be kind of a theme with people that went through World War II. And my dad, he was a soldier in World War II, and just really never did talk about his service. And I thought that was odd because he spent 3 years overseas. And most of the time in England preparing for the D-Day, and then his time in Germany and in France, but never really talked about that. I don't know if that's just the memories were too terrible. I don't know. I don't understand that. But, hey.
My dad was in for almost 3 years. It's a separate story why he didn't get shipped out. But
Sydney.
Sydney. My father was stationed in Alabama and up in the Northeast for training, and an artillery unit, the whole unit except him, got shipped to France, and most of them survived, but not a lot of discussions. And there was a local attorney, John Klaus, who's very famous in our community, and he stood over 30 straight days in the trenches, and he never talked much about it, and he saw his best friend killed in front of him, and he crawled out to get him and brought him back. It was a Jewish guy. But all the guys I knew from World War II, they didn't always they didn't brag about anything. They didn't really go into their heroism, and all they did to sacrifice so that you and I are sitting here today.
That's right. I watched the inaugural series, your talk at USI. Good turnout for the first series. What was the initial reaction, Charlie?
I was overwhelmed by the positive reaction to the initial presentation, the number of people that came. It was like 7 o'clock in the middle of the week. Yeah. And everybody's got lives and everybody's busy, and there were almost 200 people there, and to me that was really fabulous, and the positive responses that I got from the people that were there. A young lady, if I can digress to tell you the story, came up to me when it was over, and she said, "I have a question," and of course, I listened to her question. Her question was, what do I think Irene would do if she was asked about whether or not she would want to relive her life, knowing everything she had to go through and what went on. And, you can flippantly say whatever you want, and it caused me to pause. And My conclusion was, just based on knowing her and the family for all these years, was that I think she would have been willing to relive for her life again, even though there was a quote that I read at the speech about how horrible the Holocaust was for her. But I still thought in the redemption of life that she probably would have. And this young lady smiled and said that's what she hoped I would say. But to get the one quote that I gave that I thought really exemplifies how bad the Holocaust was for Irene was she wrote about her grandfather who died of cancer. And she thought he was lucky to have died of cancer than having to have lived through the Holocaust. So I don't know where I came up with my answer that I think she would have still wanted to go on, just because I think of the message and her spirit of wanting to make sure it never happened again. So I don't know. I could be wrong, obviously, but just that talk about someone having lost my mom from cancer, to know that she thought that was a blessing as opposed to, gives you a picture of how horrible the experience had to have been. And she wasn't even in a concentration camp. Mm-hmm. So,
can you give us any kind of a preview of future speakers?
Well,
this is going to be similar themes.
Yeah, they're going to. Well, they're not going to be about the Recknicks. The next one is going to be a speaker who's going to talk about her research and writing about her view of how bad the Holocaust was and turning it into a book.
Okay.
Be an author. And then I think we'll go out and be the goal to bring people to the community who have a different vision and different experiences with their studies about the Holocaust. But I think they'll all be centered on that. And hopefully, I know this was a concern that Irene wanted to have, was to point out where there's evidence and there's hints of those conditions that allowed the Holocaust to occur reoccurring again in history, like just recently in Italy with the election of a Mussolini worshiper who became the prime minister like within the last 6 weeks, I believe. So I think that's where that'll be my focus. And then when I'm no longer around or have a brain that's working, we've ensured other people to take over the role with the university to have input to ensure that goes forward.
Now let's go back to post-war Europe. The Recknicks are reunited, father, mother, and daughter. Now, of course, we talked about in Poland, their property had been stolen and many of their family members murdered. Nothing left for them in Dubrovia Górnicza. So they moved to Belgium and there for 8 years. So what did Edward do for a living in Belgium?
Well, it's not really well documented. He worked in some shops and did basic labor, to keep them alive. There's a picture that was in the presentation of where they lived, and then he met up with his brother and sister-in-law, and then I think that they actually were involved in some aspect of jewelry or gems, and
was Antwerp, wasn't it?
Yes.
Okay, which is the diamond capital of the world. Yeah.
And so I believe they were involved in some form of diamond trading and other jewelry trading, and they had to save up enough money to be able to get to the United States.
Mm-hmm. And that was in 1953 when the Recknicks arrived in Evansville. What was that transition like for Irene? She's a teenager now, going from metropolitan Antwerp to Evansville, Indiana.
She ends up going to Bosse High School, graduates from Bosse High School, eventually graduated she was at the University of Evansville, but she actually got her postgraduate education at the University of Wisconsin. But for her mother dying in a car wreck, she would have become a PhD. But she came back, devoted her life to her dad at the end until his death.
Now, who did they know in Evansville?
Okay, the family that brought them here was the Kaiser family. And the person at the time was a gentleman by the name of Clement, or Clem as he was known, Kaiser. And he had a ladies' dress store on Main Street right off of 4th, between 4th and 5th Street.
Kaisers.
Kaisers.
I remember that, yes.
It was on the north side of Main, so it'd be probably northeast part of that intersection there, like the second or third shop down from 4th Street. And he sponsored them, and they came to Evansville, and Eddie got a job doing some kind of menial work at the Stanley men's manufacturing place above where
I know that place. I know that place. One of my high school classmates, his dad worked at Stanley's. And I remember I went up to that place, and all the fabrics were up there, and all the men's clothing and everything. It was really cool.
Yeah, it was. And it was right near where Strauss's became located. So anyway, he was there. He worked, and he was very creative. And he would gather bundles of fabric, and he would go home, got a sewing machine, and he would make shorts. And he would then take them around and sell them to other stores downtown. And eventually, doing all of that, he had a lady who helped him with the buttonholes. She had a machine. He didn't have that on his. So eventually, he started his own manufacturing place, but it was for women's clothes, and it was called Edwards Manufacturing. And he and his brother Nathan operated that for a number of years, and today United Caring Shelter is in the building where that was located.
Wow, that's quite a story.
Yes.
Now I'm curious. Okay, Regina died in an auto accident, and then so Irene came back to Evansville to be with her dad. Did Irene ever marry?
No, she never married.
Mm-hmm. And I think she's also quoted as saying she never cooked and never drove.
She never drove.
She had to cook sometime, I would think.
I don't. People were nice and would help her out with food. And then in the last, I can't tell you how many years, a lady by the name of Anne Blanford befriended her and basically dedicated her day-to-day existing to helping Irene and taking care of Irene. She's a remarkable person, Anne is. But, yeah, I don't think that Irene did much domestic work.
Now,
she was a brilliant lady, but...
How old was she when she died?
87, I believe.
87, okay. Now, she had a remarkable life. She liked to travel.
And she went to I don't know if you're familiar with it. I assume you are, but there's a great books university in Santa Fe, New Mexico called St. John's University. And she went there and went through the course and read all the great books and got an education there later in life.
Well, she liked the New Yorker, I think. That was one of her favorite magazines. She'd read all the articles in that. Well-read.
Well-read. She's very
cosmopolitan.
Well-read. Yes. And she traveled. She liked to travel. She traveled on her own till later in life, and Anne would help her in traveling. And she was a fascinating person. She walked everywhere. You could see her walking down Washington Avenue. She stayed in her parents' home until her death. But she'd go to Schnucks there on Green River Road, whichever location it was in on either side of Green River Road. And she would walk home, and people would befriend her and give her rides from time to time.
There was a graveside service at Mount Carmel Cemetery for Irene.
Right.
And there was some symbolism there. for this Jewish service. The rabbi was there, of course, and the group were wearing black ribbons. Is that right, Charlie?
Yeah, there's a Jewish tradition that when you mourn the loss of a person, normally it's the immediate family, but in this case, Irene didn't have any immediate family. So those that were there that were willing to do it, there's a black ribbon, and it's cut to signify the loss after the person is buried, and you wear it underneath your lapel if you have a coat on, or on your shirt collar. And I find it really kind of somewhat emotionally significant to do that. And
I think the rabbi mentioned that when you tear the ribbon, it's a heart is broken.
right. And so, yeah, I've worn it more times than I want, but I haven't had to have anybody wear one for me. Hope that's put off a little while, but I'm getting close.
Now, going to the gravesite and the coffins in the grave, and the attendees are invited to toss some dirt on the grave.
Correct.
And they do it with a shovel, but the shovel is turned upside down.
And I'm not totally knowledgeable on why the shovel. You might have remembered or heard in the service what the rabbi said about it.
There were kind of a reluctance
To put somebody in the ground.
to put the dirt on there. So
And
they
you
do it
throw
with
it-
the backside of the shovel.
Yeah, right. You throw it, it goes on to the casket itself before it's lowered into the grave. And if it's a truly kosher casket, it has no metal in it. It's only wood. And so I presume that that's what Irene had. I think those arrangements had already been put together somewhat with the funeral home that handled the matter at the time.
So I didn't know there was a kosher burial.
It's I think it's a misuse of the word kosher, because kosher is over food, but to be truly compliant with Jewish tradition, there's no metal in the casket, and it's just all wood. I mean, that's what I picked out for me. My parents, my grandparents, they were all in those types of caskets.
Now, on all the stones, the markers in English and in Hebrew?
Yes. And then you leave a rock. You don't leave flowers at the gravesite to express rocks last forever, the eternal nature of the person's soul. To be there when you go to the gravesite in remembrance, you would take a rock, and I remember as a kid doing it to some of my grandparents' graves.
I did that, Charlie, in Ukraine.
Wow.
I was in the city Ternopil, Ukraine. I was there to help a television station get started over there after they. This was in 2002, and they took us to. One of the people on my trip was a Jewish guy, and we went. He wanted to see the Jewish cemetery in Ternopil, which was run down, of course. And, of course, the Orthodox cemetery is very well kept and everything. So we went to, and they reluctantly took us to the Jewish cemetery because it was in such bad shape. They didn't want to show that off. But we went there, and we put rocks on the graves. He told me that. He said, that's a symbol of respect. So we found some stones, and we went around and put rocks on there.
Oh, neat. That's awesome.
That was really neat.
Yeah.
That was really quite I still have that vivid memory of doing that. And, of course, the cemetery, of course, a lot of people, I'm sure, were killed by the Germans.
Yes.
The Ukrainian Jews. So anyway, we've had the service there for Irene, the graveside service. Now she was supporting the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I have not been there. I want to go there. You have been there. Tell us about the museum, Charlie.
It's a life experience. Just you get the enormity of the loss. I mean, there's one place there where there are just shoes. I'm probably going to choke up a little bit, and just the enormity of all these people. Just for no reason other than they had a belief in a certain religion, and they were slaughtered. I mean, no other way to put it. And the museum goes through showing the enormity of that with actual relics from some of the camps that they were able to save and bring and put this building together, and photos and photographs of the faces. And they're large, many places in the museum, there are large photographs, and it just pierces right through your heart seeing all of that. And I would recommend it for everyone. We took our kids there, and I'm so glad I did it.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the Germans documented everything.
They did.
Meticulous, and of course that's ironic that you'd have all that documentation of what they did.
And that documentation then allowed them to have Nuremberg and made it. The evidence was all set out many times in that way.
But they're still deniers
right.
of the Holocaust, which I find that incredible.
They're deniers of so many things today. The one thing that I didn't mention earlier in our discussion is that delivering this talk, which was truly, I didn't realize the honor that it was. And if it wasn't for Leslie Simmons, who did all the research to put this lecture, make it happen, Irene didn't envision what it would take to do this lecture, but she was friends with Leslie Simmons, and as well as Anne Blanford. And Leslie is a fabulous speechwriter that made me look like I wasn't the dummy or that I was. But delivering this talk really was eye-opening and inspiring to me, and was a life experience I never dreamed I would have, because it really moved me to be able to deliver the message that she wanted. And I'm still inspired by the event of delivering the speech and by the message. So it really touched me.
Mm-hmm. And that's just one family, just one story out of millions of stories of people how their lives were affected and the lives lost. It's unbelievable. So how many Recknick family members were lost?
I don't know. There were a number of members lost, like his brother Nathan's wife was killed. It wasn't Eddie and Regina had Hollywood finished, as you talked about, but Edward's wife was killed, and his second wife, Alina's husband, was killed, and they were all from the same city in Poland, and so it wasn't Hollywood for very many people, and then if you look at the Recknick family from the Regina side of it, the mother's side, the Siegelmans, there were 12. I'm trying to remember, but there was this chart that Leslie found and put up on the board, and it was devastating how many.
Yeah, you show the family tree, and then they're just gone.
It's just a white space. But they had a high survival rate in one sense, because about 30% of the Siegelmans survived, which was a large number. It sounds ridiculous that 30% of the people live and 70% are killed. That's a high, but it was.
In that pamphlet, the Gumberts and the Hymans were some of the first Jewish families moving into Evansville. B'nai Israel, established in 1857.
Yeah, that was an Orthodox synagogue. And the rock, the cornerstone of that congregation was preserved and was recently discovered and brought to Adath B'nai Israel, and the rabbi is trying to figure out what he's going to do with it.
Well, how did they discover it?
Well, somebody has a nefarious history, because somebody had it that shouldn't have had it, and it was removed from the building, became a church, and then at some point the building was torn down. It was on Second, and somebody got a hold of it, but in the
at least
end,
it was preserved.
Yeah, at least it was preserved, and in the end it was returned to the community that it belongs to.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think there was a report that there was a group of 40 male adults in B'nai Israel, the first temple. Many of these, mostly German immigrants, they eventually became merchants and business leaders.
Yeah, and in Evansville, if you were to look at there's 3 Jewish cemeteries, 2 active ones. And if you would go to the really old sections, the 1800s, the early 1900s, which I did years ago with Sherman Marver, who was a merchant, ran a jewelry store, he and his brother. Mm-hmm. But the first Jews in Evansville were definitely all German. And if you were to go and look at some of the names, you could be easily confused as to whether you were in an old section of St. Joe Cemetery on the west side, as opposed to being in the Jewish cemetery next to Evansville Country Club, because the names are fairly common across the board.
But there's Hebrew on the...
there's Hebrew on the Jewish.
Right, that would identify them.
That's the critical, one of the critical appearance differences.
Now, tell me about your parents, Sidney and Sidel.
Yeah, my mom and dad my mom was from Bayonne, New Jersey, and my dad was from Brooklyn and Manhattan. And they eventually ended up in St. Louis, Missouri. They both worked for the Rural Electrification Administration, which was trying to bring electricity to rural America. And they were decentralized because the government was fearful that Germans might bomb the United States. So they moved all these different government offices to different places. And so they ended up going to St. Louis. And then my dad went in the Army for almost 3 years. And got out, and somebody told him Evansville was a good place to come and practice law, which wasn't true. And they came here, and he made $100 the first 2 years he was here. But for my mom working as a union secretary, they wouldn't have survived here. So,
well, how did they meet?
Oh, they met in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
The gentleman who founded the Wilderness Society was friends of my mom and dad separately, and he introduced him in Washington, D.C., and the rest is kind of history.
Now, did you ever work with your dad?
Yeah, I was fortunate to get to work with him from 16 years, from 1972 to 1988 when he died. My mom died in 1984. But no, I had a remarkable learning experience and work experience with my dad. It wasn't conventional, but it certainly made me what I am today, having been influenced by him, and he was a taskmaster.
Well, he was represented labor unions, is that correct?
Right. He was a very courageous person. He represented labor unions. He represented the people that desegregated Woolworths. He filed the lawsuit to desegregate the swimming pools in Evansville. And he did a lot of things that caused him to get significant negative back in those days. And the biggest thing that he did was he was in trial for 6 months in federal court in St. Louis, representing a gentleman by the name of William Sentner, who was the vice president of the UE, the union. He was a known communist, but he was prosecuted under the Smith Act, which made it illegal to be a communist. So my dad represented him, lost the trial, but won in the Supreme Court of the United States. So he didn't get paid a penny for that whole experience.
And that was a lot of time he spent on that.
Yeah, he did. But my parents were interested in trying to make the world a better place and not interested in worldly things as much. They like to travel, but there's a lot I should have learned from them that I maybe didn't pick up on.
Well, you're kind of picked up that passion too, didn't you? You kind of made some enemies and
I have
kicked some trash cans, as they say.
Yeah, I have, but not to the degree or the courage that they were here. They didn't have anybody. Mm-hmm. They were alone, and their parents were in New York City.
Mm-hmm. So your experience of doing this lecture series, I know it's really affected you. Any other projects you got were in the works?
No, I don't know. I mean, I would still like to make a bigger difference than I've made. So that's, I had issues with the way that the school corporation has neglected underserved schools in terms of if we were to all look and study those test results. But I haven't been successful there, and I'm still a work in motion as long as I'm functioning and can stand up.
Yeah. Well, Charlie, we go way back. We're we're classmates at the University of Evansville, and I know I was editor of the school newspaper, and you were always kind of involved in some kind of a project or a protest on campus.
And I still remember, and I still may have the copy of the Crescent where you interviewed me. And I had a paper called The Iconoclast.
Oh, that's right. It
was sort of a mild underground version of a school paper. And I had fun. I was also a bench warmer when I was at U of E, so on the football team. But
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I sat on the bench, made some good friends still today. But you had a good time at U of E, and I really enjoyed you interviewing me. I still remember that.
Great memory. Now, you went on into law school where?
I went to law school at IU in Indianapolis and came back here in the summer of '72 and had a very dull existence of just being a lawyer for the last 50 years.
Well, I wouldn't say it was a dull existence. You represented Julie Van Orden. That wasn't a dull experience.
No, that was a really
the lady who shot former
murdered, in my opinion, one of the most popular mayors in the history of Evansville, and it was a really good person. Mayor Lloyd was, that took a toll on my family. I was gone for over 4 weeks. We only had one car. My wife had to live with garbage in the yard, phone calls, and that kind of thing. And I was glad in the end, I handled the case because lawyers are we're kind of a little different sometimes. And then I handled one of the worst murders I've ever seen as a prosecutor, and the only death penalty case I ever was involved in was where Jeffrey Weisheit burned up 2 young children on the West Side. So, yeah, I've seen a broad spectrum of what goes on in court.
But he was eventually executed, wasn't he?
He's still sitting there.
He wasn't?
No.
Oh, I'm thinking of Wrinkles, maybe.
Well, Wrinkles, or you're also probably thinking of Judge Pigman's prosecution of Donald Ray Wallace, who was the murder of Mayor Lloyd and the family that Wallace murdered all occurred within about 2 or 3 months of each other.
That's right.
And but Donald Ray Wallace was eventually executed.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Julie Van Orden, did you volunteer to do that, or did they approach you? Or
I was appointed by the court.
Okay, there you go.
I was a public defender in circuit court.
Okay, so that was your out. I'm doing my job.
Yeah,
doing my job. Charlie Berger, thanks for being my guest. Charlie, of course, the inaugural speaker of the Edward and Regina Recknick Holocaust series at the University of Southern Indiana, endowed for in perpetuity. Is that what you say it?
In perpetuity.
In perpetuity, yeah, yes. So hopefully.
I hope.
Yeah, so we're expecting another speaker next year. And
yes.
Charlie, thanks so much for being my guest.
Thank you, David. It's really an honor that you would ask me to be here.
Well, thank you. I'm David James, and this is 2 Main Street.